So we're gonna go over creating an in-game UI, and then we're gonna connect our uh, various parts of the game to a global script to keep track of any properties that we want. I'm gonna demonstrate keeping track of the number of items you've collected, which is sort of like points. And I'm also going to keep track of the player's lives, how many lives the player has left, and so we can make some choices based on that. But you can really do anything. You can track different items. You can track specific things that the player needs to unlock aspects of the game. There's lots of different stuff you can do with this. So we created some UI stuff. Last time we created this little start menu and a instructions menu. And we connected some buttons, and we went over a few basic things there. But what we're going to create now is a little bit different in the sense that it's going to actually be sort of a layer on top of our main game. And so we're still going to create a separate UI scene, but then we're going to actually import it into or link it into our game scene. So I'm going to make a new scene here. I'll get rid of these. And this is also a user interface scene. And I'm going to call this metrics. Metric is just like a word for, counting something that has units or whatever. And so that's generally what we refer to things like points or currency or other things that we want to keep track of in the game. There's different terms that you might use for this, but we're going to go with metrics. And for this one, we're going to do a really simple design. So we're going to avoid really doing any kind of crazy layout because we don't have that much stuff that we need to keep track of. A lot of games will have like a big sort of like HUD system or heads-up display system where there's like, you see different things in different areas. You have like a map, all that stuff. You can do all those types of things in Godot, but obviously we don't have time to cover all that stuff, so we're just going to go over a pretty basic setup. So for my metrics, I'm going to be keeping track of two things. One is the number of items that I've collected, and the other is how many lives the player has. And we're going to go over two different ways of displaying data. One is just having basically a number that changes that's displayed, and then the other is having like different icons that the number of those icons changes. And you see both of those in different games used in different ways, but those are kind of the main ways that we'll see it. There are other things you might want to do, like a health bar or things like that, which are a little more complicated, but you can do them, and Godot has some built-in stuff for that as well. But let's get started. So I'm going to start out with the number of items that the player has, and for this, I'm going to add a sprite with just the regular animation of the items. So you could make another artwork for this if you want. But just to save time, I'm just going to add a regular sprite. So I'm going to click here. I'm going to make an animated sprite. The animated sprite doesn't always work that well within the UI system, but I'm using something really basic, so I'm not super worried about it. But if you're doing something more complicated, you'll probably have to add some extra nodes to kind of make sure it sits in the right place. We kind of looked at that a little bit last week. So I'm going to create some new sprite frames, and I just need one animation here, so I'm not even going to bother changing the default. I'm just going to set this to autoplay and then open up my art using the little waffle button. I'm going to go to sprites, and for my apple item, I'm just going to use that apple. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I have three horizontal frames and 3 vertical frames. I'm just going to take these first 3, and if we set this to play, that's basically just what the icon is going to look like. So it's going to look the same as the in-game item. So you may want to make different art so it looks different. Obviously, you can do that and just throw the different art in here. But that is our Apple icon, and I'm just going to drag this down a little bit. If we look at the metrics, this is going to be like how it's overlaid. This big rectangle is how it's overlaid on the game itself. And I'm just going to put stuff basically in the top left corner, because that's kind of the easiest thing to do. But if you want it to go somewhere else, you can set it to go somewhere else. So next to my sprite, I'm going to just create a label to show the number. You could like put it right on top of it if you wanted to do it that way, but I'm just going to put it next to it. So I'm going to add a label. This is a UI element that we actually used when we were doing our dialogue thing, but I'm just going to do this here. So in the label, I'm just going to put a 0 just so I can see what that's going to look like. And then I'm going to move it next to the apple. And of course, if you want to change the font or the color, you can do this. Changing the font is actually kind of a tricky process, so I'm not going to go over that right now, but there's some good tutorials online on how to do that, and I can go over it if anybody wants to change the font. But we can change like the color if we want to match the apple. Oh, I have to let Godot see the screen. Uh-oh. Okay, so let's quit and reopen real quick. Oh, I haven't saved the scene. So before I quit and reopen, let's go into scenes, go to UI, and I'm just going to call this metrics and click save. And so now I'm going to make sure to open Godot again. Make sure I'm using the most recent version, which I am, and then edit this again. Okay, so there's our label. My text disappeared for some reason. Okay, that's weird. I don't know what would have changed between now and before, but let's just delete that and try that again. So I'm gonna make a label and put, okay, so I don't know why that disappeared, but now we've got it back. Let's move it over here and try to align it. And then let's change the color. So I'll just use the color picker and choose the apple color. So you don't have to match the color, but you might want to. You can choose whatever color you want there. And then I might make this a little smaller. Although it is gonna probably, if I go up to double digits, I might want to make it bigger. So I might want to look at what it looks like with double digits. And then if I had triple digits, obviously I would have to worry about that. Okay, so that's one type of UI where we just have a number and we use that apple to indicate what the number represents. And then the number can just go up, or maybe it changes in different ways, but it'll just show the exact number there. So the other one we're going to do is a series of icons that represent a number by the number of icons we have. And to do that, I'm going to use an animated sprite again. And I'm going to, this time I'm going to do my heart animation for the player lives. So I'll set this default to autoplay. And I'll go into my sprites and find this heart animation, the life animation. And again, I have 3 horizontal, 3 vertical, so I'll just grab those frames and I'll see what that looks like. And so I'm just gonna do 3 of these. So, you know, depending on how many players you want, or lives, I guess this is life number 1. Depending on how many lives you want the player to have, you can make a certain number of these icons. And again, this doesn't have to be lives, but that's usually what we do. So I'm just going to duplicate this a couple times. And so I have a couple different scripts that we can use that will update these values when things change in the game. So we're going to have to add a few different things. So most of what we're going to go over now is connecting all this stuff to different scripts. But now that we have this set up, let's see how it looks in the scene. So I'm going to open up one of my levels. Open up level 3. That's what I've been working on most recently. And so in level 3, what we'll do is we'll just create a new canvas layer. And by creating a new canvas layer, that will make this UI layer ignore changes in the camera. If we didn't do that, it would just move when we move the player. So the first thing that I have to do is click on the main node and add a new canvas layer. And I'm going to move this up here and just rename this UI. You could really call it whatever you want. It doesn't matter that much. And then in here, that's where I'm going to link my metrics scene that I just created. So I'm going to link and then use metrics. And the reason I don't just build this directly into this scene is because I might want to use it in different levels and different types of levels. And so that way I don't have to worry about recreating it. So there we see the metrics superimposed in our game. And when we run the game scene, you'll see that there they are sitting up at the top left corner. And so since we have it in the canvas layer, they always stay there. Even if I start to move within the level, they don't move along with the player. So we'll always be able to see those metrics in the upper left-hand corner. And then once you see them in the game, you might want to change the design a little bit, maybe make them bigger or smaller, make some more space in between the metrics and the corner, or maybe less space, depending on how you have it set up. But you can, kind of design it to look how you want. Okay, so now let's connect all our scripts. So let's go back to the metrics scene first, and then we're going to have to also connect a script that isn't part of any of our scenes. And so this is a little bit like when we went over the dialogue system, how we have this plugin that works everywhere. We're going to add a global script that is loaded in the project that's not associated with one scene. So it's always there, so we can reference things that will stay the same on every level. To do that, I go to Project and go to Project Settings, and then I go to Auto Load. And this basically means scripts that are going to load as soon as the game starts. You can see the Dialog Manager has its own auto load script. And so we're just going to choose the global script for this. So inside the default scripts folder, you'll see there's a global.gd. I'm going to open that up and click Add. And then it should be by default, but you have to make sure it's clicked Enabled. And so now that script will be there whenever we load the game. And let's take a look at that script for a second. So I'm going to go to my script editor and go to Open. Go to Scripts and go to Global. It's actually quite short. So we'll see, basically there's a couple things in here. One is this dictionary called props. A dictionary is a data structure that's really useful in programming because we can basically define different properties. So props is short for properties, and we can define different properties so you can add properties and you can call them whatever you want. And the way that this works is that we don't even have to have those properties actually in this global script. Anything that you name a property within your UI will automatically get added into this dictionary if it's not already there. So for me, I have some defaults like a life property and an item property. If you have multiple properties that you want to keep track of, like let's say you have some keys, you have some books, you have some different types of items, you don't even have to change this script. You just have to put them into the individual metric scripts, which we'll add in a second. Another thing I have in here, just as an example, is some properties you might want to have to check in your game logic in other places. So like the player lives max, this is like the maximum number of lives a player can have. If you want to define things that won't be edited or aren't part of the props dictionary, you can just put them right in here and they'll be accessible in all of your scripts in other places. And then there's one more thing in here. This is a restart function, and this basically just says if you restart the game, it resets these properties. So that might be useful. You might have to edit this. It's just there as kind of a placeholder. You may have to add some stuff that's specific in your game to get this to work correctly. But anyway, that's the idea of a global script, and we call it global because it's present everywhere. So every scene has access to the script just by using the term global. And we'll see what that looks like in a couple of our other scripts in a second. So now let's go to our metric script and add a script here. So if I click on the script node and go to load and go into scripts, you're going to see if we look at this area starting with metric count, there's 3 different scripts related to the metrics. So there's the metrics manager, which manages all of the metrics. There's the metric count, which is for the point or item type of metric where we're counting up from a number. And then there's the metric toggle. This is for the life type of metric where we're just toggling something on and off. For the, main metrics node, we're going to use the metrics manager. So I'm going to click open. And let's take a look at this script for a second. It's also pretty short. It's pretty simple. It has a list of the metrics that are in this particular scene. And then when we call this update function, which we can do from our global script or from other places, it'll just make all of those metrics update the display based on the global properties. So it's essentially going through the global properties, checking to see if there's a metric that has that name, and then updating the display of those properties. So it's really very simple, but it means that we have to set things up correctly. So that's our first script, and you can see in the script properties the metrics paths. So we're just going to take metrics like our label and drag them into here. So actually I have to click on this first and then add elements. So I'm going to add a few elements, and then I'm going to drag these into here like that. So before we do that, let's add our scripts and take a look at those. So with our label, we're going to add a script for this one. So I'll click on the label. So there are just a lot of different scripts we have to connect to each other. So for our label script, we're going to go to load and go to scripts, and we're going to go to metric count. So this is when we count a number. So I'm going to open that up, and let's take a look. So basically, this metric has a default property, which is what it's counting. So that's how you can change the different things that we're count. So if you put like coin in here, or point, or key, or whatever it is you want to count, that will add that into the global properties. Then it just updates the display. And actually the way that this is written, I'm realizing we need to put this in a separate node because we're referencing the label here. So actually, yeah, I forgot a step. Sorry about that. So these actually need to go into a node so that it'll be referenced correctly. So let's just add a basic control node. And we'll put this up here. And we'll call this items. And then I'm going to throw both of these into my control node. And then actually the script should not be on the label because it references the label. The script should be on items. So let's load that. And I have a feeling I need to do the same thing with a life because I think I changed the way this is set up. Anyway, now if I click on here, I just say whatever the metric name. I'm just going to leave item as a kind of default. And we'll count that in a little bit. And then the script, you can see, references this label. So it just updates the label to show the number of that item that we have. So we'll see how that works in a minute. There are just like a lot of little tiny steps with this one. So it's a little tricky. Let's go ahead and look at our toggle script before we do anything else. Okay, so yeah, our toggle script also needs a parent node. So let's add another control node and call this life. And let's throw our 3 life animations in there. And let's add the script for the metric toggle. So a metric toggle is when we want to toggle things on and off based on a value. And so for the life, we have a couple things. The metric name, we're going to change this to life. And then the display sprites. So we have 3 display sprites. So we're just going to add 3 elements and then just drag these sprites in here. And so when we update this this metric, it'll turn those sprites on or off depending on the value that we have. So that script is also pretty simple. You have your metric name and then the display sprites. And then when we update the display, it's just going to match the display to the value. Okay. So I think that's everything that we need in here. The really tricky part is how do we connect what's happening in our scene to what's happening in the metrics. So let's go over that now. So in our scene, now we have this metrics thing here. And when certain events happen, like if our player collects an apple. So let's move our player. Oops. Let's lock these. Let's move our player over here. Let me lock the camera as well. Let's move the player over here so we can test this a little bit more easily. So we can test both getting an item by going down here, and then we can also test losing our lives by going into the snake pit. So there's different events that will cause these things to occur. And if we go to our node tree, we'll see some of those events. So we have the player fall or the player gets hit is part of our player. For our rewards, we have a signal for when a reward gets collected. And for our obstacles, we have, oh no, that goes in the player hit, so we're gonna ignore that one. So we need to connect those, and to connect those, we need something else in the scene that just is kind of aware of everything in the scene, because otherwise we'd have to write all this code either into the player or into the components that doesn't really belong there. So I'm gonna make another node that's just a completely blank node. And I'm going to call this the scene manager. And this takes a script that's just going to connect everything together. So I'm going to put this all the way up here at the top of the level. And I'm going to go to my inspector and load a script. And this script is the scene manager script. And this is the one where if your game has different features or works differently than how my game is set up, you're going to have to make the most changes. So you may want to think about those changes, and then we could talk about how to set them up. But if we look at this scene manager script, you'll see that there are various functions that can be related to keeping track of our items and other things like that. There's a couple errors in here. Oh, okay, so there's a global item script. I actually forget what's in there. Let's look at our scripts for a second and see what is there. Items global. This is something that we would need if we were doing checkpoints, so we'll cover this later. So I'm just going to comment this out for now so we don't have to worry about that error. So I'm just going to put a little hashtag in front of that. Same thing with the checkpoints. And so we have a few functions here. We have a lose life function, a calc lives or calculate the number of lives function. We have the on player fall function, on player hit. And you can see there's some basic logic built in here. So for example, if the player gets hit, we're going to call the lose life function. So we'll take a life away from the player. And then we'll see if the player is still alive. If the player is not alive, we'll call the player died function. And then finally, at the bottom, we update our metrics. So you can see this is a way for us to connect the different components of our scene. And we don't really have to change anything major right now. We just have to tell the scene manager where to find the metrics and where to find the player. And then we have to connect some nodes. So let's go to the scene manager. And first it wants to know where the player is. So I'm just going to click assign and click player and say OK. Then it wants to know where the metrics is. So I'm going to find the metrics and click OK. It also has a game over and a game won. We don't have those yet, so we're just going to ignore those for now. We'll work on that in another demo. But now we need to connect some signals. So let's click on the player, go to the node section. We're going to double click player fall. And we're going to connect this to our scene manager. And just make sure you click the pick and on player fall and click connect. And as usual, you should see the green arrow here once we click somewhere. So then let's also connect the player hit to our scene manager and make sure you get the right function and click connect. And that looks good. And now there's some defaults here for how these things work. And then on item collected is the last thing that we want to connect. So for this one's a little bit trickier. You're going to have to do this with all of your items. So that might be a little tedious. You could, delete your items and connect it and then duplicate them. And that will duplicate the connection as well. But I'm just going to go through and do it real quick. So I have an apple here. Going to connect on collected and pick on item collected, and click OK. For some reason, I had to say compatible. I had to turn off these toggles. I guess I don't have the right number of variables, I guess, but it should be fine. We might have to fix that, but I'm going to click connect, and then I'm just going to do that with each one of these. Apples, and actually, it looks like I haven't added any hearts into the scene, so maybe we'll do that at the end if we want to. Okay, so we've connected all these things, and I think this should all work now. I'm sure there's things I forgot, but let's go ahead and give this a test. So I should see the metrics update when I collect an apple. No, so we missed something. So let's see if we got any errors. No, okay. Okay, so let's do a couple tests. So if we don't get that connection, there's a couple places where we can test. So let's see. Let's make sure that the collected function is getting called. So I'm going to go to the Apple script and just make sure. Let's double check our collectible type. Oh, I actually set the collectible type to Apple. So that's where I got this wrong. Is that my collectible type is Apple, but my metric is looking for item. So we can fix that pretty quickly. Let's go back to metrics, and here where it says metric name, we actually need to do the apple, not the generic item. So let's change this to apples. And that's actually a good thing to go over, because if you have different things that you're collecting, you'll have to make that change in your game. So let's try that again. We still don't get it, so now we'll have to do some debugging. So let's go to our Apple script and just make sure. So I'm just going to print right here, Apple collected, and make sure we're getting the right type. So I'm just going to print this out to the console just to make sure that is working. And let's try it again. Okay, so let's check our output. Okay, it says Apple collected Apple. Okay, so that worked. So now let's check that our signal connected to the right place. So let's go to our scene manager and let's print out the item type here. So I'll say scene manager collected, and I want to put a note, some message here that is not confusing, and then I'll put the item type. So we can double check that the scene manager is getting this item type, right? Yes, that's working. So we see scene manager collected apple. So that's working. So let's see. So then we go to metrics UI update. Although we don't, another thing that we can check, so the item type is not life, and since it's not life, we do some like logic here to see how many lives the player has. But if it's not a life, it's just a generic item, we're going to check if it has that item. So let's print this and see if this is working. So this is saying if that global property exists. And so let's put a message here, global prop exists. And then let's print it out again down here. So it should go from false to true if it's set up right. So we're just printing the same thing down here. I'm going to move this over so we can see the output. Okay, so it goes from false to true, so that is working correctly. Okay, so then we go to metrics UI update, so let's make sure that's happening. So I'll go to metrics UI. Oh man, I just realized I never added the metrics into the metrics manager. Okay, so this is the type of mistake I make all the time. We have to actually add these metrics in here. So there's our apple and there's our life. Okay, so that's what I forgot to do. I forgot to add the actual metrics into the metrics manager paths for the individual metrics. This allows me to have as many metrics as possible, or as I want. Now we should see this update if we run the right level. There we go. So now we can see when I collect an apple, I get the apple update. So now if I get hit by a snake, I should see my lives disappear. And I do, and there's some logic in here to end the game, which it doesn't work because we don't have a game over scene. So that's what we'll do on Thursday. So I'll comment this out for now, and we can see that in action again. So if I get hit by the snake enough times, I should run out of lives. And then the lives actually reset because we'd be resetting the level, but we'll implement that logic on Thursday. So that's basically it. You can tell there's a lot of steps. There's a lot of different things that we need to fix to make all of this stuff work together. But if you want to have some metric system in your game, you're going to need some version of this where you connect what's happening in the game to a global script that can see everything that's happening in all of the different scenes, in the metrics, and in different places. So it's a lot of steps. It's easy to kind of forget one or get something wrong, but you can give that a shot. And if you need help with any of that stuff, obviously we can debug it. And I think that's it. On Thursday, we will add a game over and a win game scene so we can kind of tie everything together. And I'll talk a little bit more about the logic that's happening in the scene manager script, because there's a few different things there that you may want to take out or you may want to leave in, depending on what you want to have in there.